Hi again, everybody. And I know that I'm between you and lunch, so I will be careful not to run over time. Certainly know how that part works. All right, so I changed the title again, sorry. The titles help me. They help me, and I don't know what to title a thing till I've made the thing, right? So I start off with this general idea, and then I go in and muck around, and then I'm like, oh, look, I did something just a little different, or I think a better title has come to mind here. So I just want to spend a little bit of time with you talking about the elements that you need to consider in terms of constructing a story, and with hopefully some tips along the way here. Oh, did it again. Wait. That's because I didn't tell it to start, did I? There we go. So I want to talk about 5 key elements here. Audience, and we've heard about these, right? Audience, context, data, message, and medium. So let me start with audience. How many of you have been able to narrow down and select a specific audience for your workshop project? Okay, what are the rest of you doing about audience? The people not receiving, like, I don't know what I'm doing about audience. Okay, so I'm going to suggest, as a former professor, that you do that part because it comes first in my list for a reason, right? Until you are clear about who your audience is, you do not have the basis for figuring out how to answer all of the thousands of questions that'll raise in your mind about what to present and how to present it, till you know to whom you're trying to present. Audience is primary. The audience is primary. And from this moment forward, when you're building your story, you're going to think from that point of view. What would this look like, think like, feel like, experience according to my audience? Because audience is the point, meaning is a social act. So there are a lot of different ways in my field and related fields that we talk about how meaning comes into existence, right? But the main point about this is that it is a collective endeavor, right? It requires people, not person, for meaning to actually happen. That was a photo I took, by the way, outside of a store in some small town in Maine, in case you were wondering about how I got Gumby in there. Okay. So, how many of you remember Gumby? Mostly, oh, you do? It must have had a life after I was a kid. Okay, awesome. All right, so we might also say that meaning is epiphenomenal, right? That it arises as the result of human action and interaction. So here, John Fiske is one of the larger names and very well-respected scholars in my discipline, communication studies. But he points out that there are more than two, but these are the two major perspectives on how to understand what the nature of communication is in general. And he says, so there are 2 broad types, right? First sees it as a process by which A sends a message to B, upon whom it has an effect, or hopefully has an effect, right? So this is sometimes called a transmission model, right? I call it sometimes the push model. And it was clear to me when, 10 or 15 years ago, however long I've been in the atmospheric science community, that most of NOAA and certainly the National Weather Service think of communication as pushing out information, right? I was going to shove it out there. We did our job. Communication solved, right? However, I got to point out that second definition. The second sees it as a negotiation and exchange process of meaning in which messages, people and cultures, and reality interact so as to enable meaning to be produced. Multiple efforts. So, and this is so hard, right, to I think, because it is such an abstraction to get your head around, right? But words are important, don't get me wrong. I'm a word lover. But meaning is not in the words. And it's not even in the heads of individuals. Sender over here in the moment, receiver out here in the audience. It arises in the space between us. And it takes all of us for that meaning to happen. So you have a huge responsibility when you're deliberately designing messages, right? Stories in this particular case, to be cognizant of that. And this is why, for us, from my field, audience is so key. So I need to understand sort of what I'm working with on that side. Hello. There we go. So I think you heard about this on day one briefly, but I just want to remind you that there's some key questions. Who exactly is my primary audience? And for those of you dragging your feet, really, honestly, please just answer that question. In fields like marketing and public relations, we often talk about primary audiences, secondary audiences, and sometimes some other labels for audiences I can't say in a PG setting. And so we build for the primary audience and keep in mind a secondary audience if we need to, right? So we may be aiming at one kind of group, let's say local horticultural society I'm going to talk to, but I realize that maybe at that particular event, there's going to be another kind of group that won't be the dominant group in the room, but I want to think about them as part of my audience in a specific way as well. What does my audience know about my topic? And that can be hard to guess. You do your best these days, we have the internet and Google. We are able to investigate an awful lot about humans. We just heard a lot about social data. There are a lot of sources of information, right, about populations. What direct experience might they have? Because considering that, if they do have direct experience, and you remember in my previous talk, and I apologize, I forget the gentleman's name who said he wanted to add something to what I had said, right? And he said, I asked the audience what are their experiences, right? Starting in that way is crucial. And if you can't do it by actually asking them, right? Think about what those experiences might be. And how does my audience engage with this kind of material? Now there's a million answers to that question, right? So we need to figure out how would they ordinarily encounter things, right? So if I'm talking to that horticultural club, how often are they looking at PowerPoint slides as a mechanism for understanding or learning, right? How will people come encounter? And because that's going to, later on when we talk about medium, that's going to shape in large part also the contours of your message. And then what is important to my audience relative to this topic? And as we move through this, hopefully I'll be able to show you a little video clip from a couple of TED speakers, right? Talking about this need to find a thing in the data that is significant for the audience that you're addressing and presenting in a way that shows them how important it is in order for that to have some kind of impact. Context. In communication, we say context is king. Context is everything in terms of understanding the likely meaning that will arise right through your messaging. Because remember, it's not just you shaping it, it's everybody shaping it. So context is where people are coming from and in relief against some other set of things, right? It might be their experience, like with students, I used to always think about, are these my majors or are these people coming to take a gen ed class from me, right? Because their frame of reference for how they encounter the exact same information is completely different. Consider things like physical setting of the message, right? So we live in this digital environment, and a lot of times, therefore, the digital experience is what's happening, but certainly not always. The audience frame of reference. The relationship between you and your audience, right? Do they know you in any way? They could know you personally, but I mean more generally, do they know you, right? Does your expertise, is that the reason, right, that you're engaging in this messaging with them, right? Is that an expertise that they recognize, that they understand, with which they trust, right? Like those characteristics matter. current and recent events. Whatever you're talking about, other stuff's been happening in the world around us, right? And so when people come in the room, this forms part of their context. If it's in a room or when they encounter your message, right, it may be relative to something that's been transpiring. Now, that's a tough one because and as we know from the last few years, anything and everything can happen, and it's hard to know what of that people are bringing in. But when there's something sort of large looming, it's good to take it into account. The situation of what we would call the communication event. What is the circumstance for the messaging? Like here, right, we're here at a semi-formal event that's organized in a very particular way. The particulars of that situation is understood by everybody here and everybody online, right? And what that does is pre-code for us what behaviors to expect, what the experience will be like, what kinds of information or kinds of discussion or activities are likely to transpire, right? It's good to keep those in mind. And whether the experience will be synchronous, as we are here today, or asynchronous, right, when you're dealing particularly in digital platforms. Data, you all know more about data than I do, so I wasn't going to tackle the data itself, of course, and we've heard wonderful presentations today about data. But one thing I want you to think about is how to present the data and to whom you are presenting it, right, with those two considerations. And you'll hear in a moment or two from one of the TED speakers about this, one idea per graph. Now, that doesn't mean, as we heard those and saw, like Kim's, those wonderful examples of layering some information in order to illuminate a relationship between things, right? That's okay, because the idea is not layer A or layer B. The idea you're trying to communicate is what happens at the intersection of layers A and B, right? So keep that in mind. What about that data matters most to your audience? Whoops. So I want to talk about messaging. This is a shot a photograph I took a number of years ago at the Carnegie Science Center in Pittsburgh. I was then working at what was then called California University of Pennsylvania, try not to laugh, and the meteorology program in the Earth Sciences Department hosted an event they called Stormfest, after Weatherfest from AMS, there on an annual basis. And so, and it's a longer story, I won't tell you now, but maybe later, over cocktails, about how it is that I became involved in this event with my communication students. But it's small, and I'm sorry I didn't enlarge it, but there it says on the wall, making science make sense. And I thought, yeah, right? That's sort of the underlying goal of all science communication, trying to help the science part of it make sense to the other humans involved. Make sure that you have a takeaway that you can express, ideally, in a clear, simple sentence. Right? One of the tests for how well you really understand and know something is sometimes done this way in the academy, right? Can you boil it down to a sentence? I can remember struggling to come up with a topical focus for my dissertation and my master's thesis before that, right? And you would go into my advisor and sit down, and I would talk about what I was thinking about, right? And he'd be like, yeah, that's nice, but what is your thesis going to be exactly about? Right? You have to synthesize stuff down for the other humans. And then framing is a similar idea to context, but we think of framing often within the larger picture of context of when I'm going to introduce my topic to somebody in order to present my data, in order to make some point I'm trying to make, right? Don't forget that introductory part. Don't forget to say a few things, not too many, right? But a few things that frame for people, that give them something to hold on to as to what you're about to present and how it connects to them, right? Messages should be structured. Say if you're doing presentations, right? Or the more standard form, if you think about going to, say, AMS or a conference like that, right? We definitely should be thinking about beginning, middle, and end. And when you're developing a story, stories have a beginning, a middle, and an end. They just do. That's an inherent part across all cultures, right? This is inherent. I think that scientists tend to fall short with the conclusion part. It's my pet peeve at many talks. People just don't, they just are like, yep, that's it, I think I'm done. And as I would say to my students, if you don't know if you're done, how are we supposed to know if you're done? Right? So try, right? Think about that, right? Make sure it's your last opportunity to reinforce the idea you want them to hold, the information you want them to hold on to. Length. Now, there's a lot of ways to, right? Sometimes you're given a length, right? Usually, Jasko, you got 30 minutes, right? Today, okay, right? That tells me what I can try to accomplish in that particular length. But length also in terms of audience expectation and tolerance, right? And as we know, again, in our digital context in particular, attention spans are tiny, 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 tiny. So we need to think about that, right? Which also goes back to what am I trying to communicate? What's my main idea? Have I clarified it to the point that it can be communicated effectively in a very brief period of time if I need to? I want you to think about balancing the use of details with bigger ideas, right? In public speaking, the way we talk about this is talking about main points and supporting information. So if you find that you have to compress time, for example, you always cut from the detail side, right? Shorten up, use fewer details, stay with those main ideas, right? So if you have to make a choice, go with the bigger idea rather than the tiny details. And I think that as scientists, you know, you live in those details, right? I know certainly in my content areas, like I live in the down in that rubble there. That is so much fun. That's what I love about the whole thing. But when I'm talking to other people, I have to remember they're not down there with me, and I shouldn't drag them down, right? I should raise up what's important for them. And here's an example of why framing matters in a visual sense, right? I don't know if you've seen this kind of an illustration before, right? So it's based on principles of perception that are universal. These are all well rehearsed, but the orange dots in the center are the same size. And this is why, but now just you can do the same thing with concepts or ideas, right? How you frame something determines how people interpret the thing in the middle of the frame. And it can appear important, more important because of the way you framed it. It can appear trivial and less important because of the way you've chosen to frame it. I've written here, stories meld moments together. So these are three from my phone. These are three photographs, right? And I can use them to, in a very brief way, tell you the story of how I got from communication studies into being here working with atmospheric science people, right? So the first photo, the bear, the stuffed bear in the car, so it was commencement day at Cal U, and this is the other side of campus from where I live, and I was making my way off campus in my car after the parents are gone, the kids are gone, right? But I see this car parked with this giant bear in it, and I just was in a good mood, and I was just all tickled, and I went over there and got out of my car and shut the car door and came over and took a photograph with a couple photographs of that. I was like, ha, 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 I'm going to post this on Facebook and say something clever about commencement and bears, I don't know. And then when I turned to go back into my car, the car had locked itself. And my keys, because all I had was my phone in my hand, were inside. Bad design. That is bad design. It should not be possible. Now, how did this get me started in the Earth, being with atmospheric scientists? This car is parked right outside of the Earth Science building. And two of my colleagues from that department happened to be coming across to go over to their building post-graduation. And I said, help! And those guys spent the next hour and a half scrounging tools to get into my car for me to be able to drive home. What did that lead to? The Carnegie Science Center event we called Stormfest. Got me involved in, right, because now I have more relationship with them, blah, blah, blah. That is a character we developed to be a science dude, and we named him Dewey Sleet. The students made the thing, so this brought my communication, publicity, PR, marketing, messaging stuff together with the atmospheric science folks on my campus, and that led me, and of course there's more steps in between, but that led me to the hurricane Irene assessment team a number of years later. And that led me to a position in AMS. And I got to meet people like Kevin. Medium. In my discipline, we talk an awful lot about this, that the nature of the medium shapes the message. And in fact, influences heavily how people interpret what you're messaging. Medium affects that message interpretation pretty dramatically. One of the exercises I give, and you might think about this for yourselves in a certain way, when I would give comm students, I would have them write a message of some kind, and it might be, let's say, I want a 2-page essay about X. And they would write that 2-page essay. It's a very academic thing to ask for. It's an academic style of writing. Its purpose is academic, right? Then I would say, take the content of that, and I want you to turn it into 3 tweets. But your audience with your tweets are prospective students who are most likely sophomores in high school right now to become interested in our discipline and come here to study. Now I want you to take that same content, right, and I'd pick another medium, because you have to reshape it, reframe it, right? The level of detail goes up and down, but the key message stays the same. Individuals choose media, and in particular, there's a lot of research about this in my field. They choose media to meet certain needs. So for something, how many of you have a favorite source for news? Can someone want to share that, Kevin? Washington Post? Scott?
PBS NewsHour.
Oh, no, very nice. PBS, Washington Post. We're all high-class East Coast over here. Yeah.
NPR.
NPR. Oh, you just won me right over. Okay, NPR. Yep, I'm an NPR lover, right? And I noticed, like, PBS, do you watch it on television?
YouTube.
Always, of course. See what I'm saying, right? For the...
an hour earlier on YouTube. So it's always good to watch.
There you go. There you go, right? And so, right, people have, like, so they go to their specific sources for certain kinds of information, right? And so you have to be careful, like, knowing that about your audience if you can. Where would they normally be looking and lounging about, or at least clicking through in search of something like this? How can I intersect them where it matters? Because what can happen is, right, like if you were to put stuff, let's say, and I know how old I am, up on Facebook, right, and people you were aiming at think of Facebook as family photos, right, and looking at where the people you graduated high school with are now, they might be like, what's this? And that's kind of sad you had to post it on Facebook. It's like you don't understand what Facebook is about, which means you have less credibility now, right, as a messenger. And so that stuff really starts to matter a great deal. Medium characteristics also, the characteristics of the medium create user expectations, right? So if we're doing some of our, like NPR, I don't know if you stream it, I tend to have the radio always set to, my radios are all set to NPR, so I just turn it on, I just kind of roll with the punches, like whatever NPR is doing in that moment, it's okay with me, right? And every so often, like I catch only part of a story and I'm like rats, and I go and pull it up streaming so I can hear the whole story, kind of a thing, right? So, but it creates an expectation, right, about whether it's going to be synchronous or asynchronous, about whether I'm going to be listening or I'm going to be reading, or I'm going to be watching video, right? And that should help shape how you're thinking about your story. Okay, let's see if I can pull this off. Cross your fingers. I'm not good at this kind of thing. I found multiple, if you care to search for yourself, TED Talks that deal with data and data visualization and storytelling and that kind of thing. So I picked 2 here, and if this doesn't work for me very well, because I'm a putz with this stuff, then I'm going to highly recommend you take some time over lunch or later and take a look at them. You're going to help me?
You have to share sound, so let's stop share.
Oh no.
It's okay, it's super simple. We're going to share your screen again. We're going to do
See,
this.
I told you.
Which one is it? This one?
Yeah.
asking you if it can use your sound.
Yeah, but I'm never going to remember my password right now. I apologize. Okay, you'll look at the videos later, but I can talk you through a couple of them. I apologize. Do I need to undo all of this?
What happens if it cancels? Yeah, you're good.
No, but I mean, did it just take me back to it did. Okay. All right. So before I show you these other particular examples, which are from Sean Sublet, who sent me to me, the two videos, that first video, one of the things that's really interesting there is he was a data analyst. He married, what did she do? I can't remember so he married somebody in a completely different field, and he says, these two things are just sort of separate. And then they start coming together in a way, and he also happens to study, informally, improvisational theater, and he uses that combination of stuff to figure out for himself how to actually tell a story in data, and then how to tell a story that's aimed at an audience he wants to actually impact. And in his case, he discovers that NYC, the New York City, had made all of this data that it had collected over decades and decades and decades free and accessible. So he's having a field day, right? He goes in there and he starts looking at data and he starts mapping stuff out. He starts a blog. He puts it onto, not Instagram, I forget, he puts it into another social media platform, 0 followers, but yet the content from it shows up in 3 other publications. And they cite him appropriately, but right? So he's like, whoa, this is something. I think one of the most interesting cases he does at the end of his talk is he says he takes data that looks at parking tickets that are generated from people who park at fire hydrants in the 5 boroughs. And there are 2 fire hydrants, Brooklyn, I think, 2 fire hydrants that generate an average of $55,000 a year in parking tickets. Holy smokes, right? So, and it's funny, you look at that map, and there's a lot of parking tickets lit up on the way he does his map. And then he goes to look further at that, and he discovers that one of them, the hydrant, is between, like, there's parking hydrant, bike lane, but because they've got parking spots, like lines for parking spots there, it looks like there's a bike lane, but there's a parking spot next to the bike lane. And the fire hydrant's on the other side of the bike lane. So he says, I guess people just like, well, I guess I can park here because it's marked as a parking spot and there's a bike lane. Maybe that's good enough. And he said, so the DOT had one idea, but the NYPD had another. And so, hence all those tickets. So he does this analysis and he maps it out and he sends it in to the DOT. And they're like, well, we've never gotten any complaints about this, but we'll see if there needs to be any change. And son of a gun, the Google car captures a shot, first of a car with a ticket on it right at that spot, and then lo and behold, like a month later, they repainted to indicate that there was no parking spot. And he was so happy with himself to have had an impact. And I think that those are a particularly good lesson, right? Is to figuring out where in the data is there something that actually can matter, and who's the right audience to send it to? Yeah. What's up there now, or the TED Talk? Yeah, let's at least start it. We won't go through the whole thing because it's like 15 minutes, but you get a sense of how this guy came to his. If you can move it to minute 1.50. That gets us past just his general welcoming to the audience and stuff.
Convince some of you that you too can be data storytellers if you're curious and want to. My story, a little bit about my background. So first, I work at data laws in New York. The open data laws are really exciting for people like me because it takes data that's sort of inside city government and suddenly allows anyone to look at it. So whereas before the government would analyze something and tell us, hey, this neighborhood has this many accidents, now we can see data point by data point what's happening at a very, very local level. And so when these two things came together, they ended up on, by the way, there's an open data portal I should point out that anyone can go to. It's the New York City Open Data Portal, and there's data sets on all sorts of things. In fact, there's one on the size of the televisions in Times Square and their locations. So you can, I don't know what to do with that, but it's really cool. So there's data sets of all different types, and in fact, over 1,200 data sets so far, and it's growing all the time. So I kind of took this data science work and my interest in urban planning from discussions with my wife and put it together in this blog called iQuant New York. Oh, woo, yes, somebody knows it. All right, awesome, thank you. One of the first things I did was this map.
So, and he started here with an exploratory approach, right, to data.
So red areas, hilarious injuries. No, it is interesting. Red areas are areas where people were getting in more cyclist accidents. And I found this through some public data and mapped it all. I noticed a few things. One, on the east side of Manhattan was where there was a lot more cycling accidents, more injuries. That's because that's where there are more cyclists coming off the bridges, right? But also there were some other hot spots like Williamsburg in Brooklyn or Roosevelt Avenue in Queens. And so I wrote about that and posted it on the blog. And it was more just for me to learn how to do mapping. It was this open source software called QGIS. I wanted to learn it. I posted it. And when I did, something interesting happened. People started to write about it. So Gothamist covered it. And Brooklyn actually claimed that I had claimed it was a death trap, which was not exactly what I said.
Do me a favor and jump
Streets
to
blog, and then
11:25.
even in the Atlantic. And this is just sort of from a blog that I just put on Tumblr.
He's a charmer,
and I had
this
no
one.
followers.
With
And
his
wow, that was really
presentation,
interesting.
you'll enjoy it.
So experiences there. So
I'll
I try
take
to
you
write about
to
things that New Yorkers experience. And I figured, what in can't
the
get is your
hydrant
balance
example.
if you use their buttons. So there's a trick. You can type 1905
Oh.
and get a balance. And when I wrote about this, impact. All right, so I'm working on it. And my favorite was this. I mapped fire hydrants in New York City. And these aren't just any fire hydrants. These are the fire hydrants mapped by the amount of parking ticket revenue they're creating. So these are the top 250 culprits in New York City. First, on the Upper East Side, watch out. The 19th precinct will ticket you no matter where you park for a hydrant, apparently. But more interesting were these two hydrants that were down on the Lower East Side. And they were generating $55,000 a year in tickets. Two hydrants, $55,000 for like 5 or 6 years. So finally, the data's public. I had a look. And when I went to figure out what was happening, it turns out that there's basically a hydrant and then what looks kind of like a bike lane and then a parking spot. So you go in and you're like, I'm not in front of the curb or the hydrant. There's a bike lane between us. Well, it turns out that while the DOT painted a parking spot, the NYPD disagreed. And so they would ticket the spot for years and years. And this is actually a shot from the Google Street View car going by, and it caught the ticket, which I really appreciated. So I wrote about that, and I heard from the city again. While the DOT has not received any complaints about this location, we will review the roadway markings and make any appropriate alterations. That's an action statement. We're getting better. So I thought to myself, well, government, I'm going to keep trying to make an impact. And suddenly, they repainted the spot. Yeah, impact.
You can stop it there.
So somebody's
Thank you.
listening. This is great. So you can look at your data and you can.
So let me also just highlight for you in that second video, which we're out of time for, but that the second video that's there, he talks a lot about sort of how to cleanly present, right, your visualizations. And he talks about, for example, that there's been, and he cites research about which kind of charts and graphs are more human-friendly and why. And that makes for very interesting. It starts up somewhere around minute 350. And his final example is about cholera maps. And this goes back to when cholera was a problem. So before all the digital technology, and how one physician had a hypothesis none of his peers accepted. He maps it, he maps the cases, and he has a theory that people are getting it from water. There are then public pumps on the streets of New York, and people go out and get their water. And he shows on those maps with a little bar graph effect about what was happening, and they were able to address that particular problem. Okay, sorry for running long. I promised you I wouldn't. I apologize. But have a lovely lunch. Shall I dismiss people, or would you like to?
Thank you, Susan.